Good morning. I think we're live. I'm Jimmy. This is Philosophy for Everyday Life, and the series is Kant for Everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to make sure everything's good. I think we're good. Looks like we have a couple folks here. Welcome. It's great to have you. Feel free to drop your name as well as questions and comments in the chat. Get my microphone closer. Okay. So in this series, if you are new, I've been reading through the preface of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. There are actually two prefaces because there were two editions of the book, 1781 and 1786, I believe. So we are almost at the end of the preface to the second edition. We just have one long footnote on psychological idealism left, which should be interesting. It opens up a great deal of core elements of Kant's thought. One thing I've really been struck by reading the prefaces is just how much of his argument is anticipated. The argument of the entire critique is anticipated in the prefaces. Kant really does set us up to try to set us up to understand what he's up to. Of course, to really fully understand it, you have to read further. But I've been surprised at how much has opened up just reading through these prefaces in detail. I'll say it again, I've said it a few times, that learning philosophy is like learning a language. That premise will be important for today. We're going to introduce some terms that so far we haven't discussed in this series. That are really core to understanding Kant, specifically the terms idealism and realism. So that will be interesting. I think you'll just want to keep in mind that I think everything I'll be able to say today is more or less going to be a heuristic, in the sense that it's going to be an oversimplification. Much of it will not be quite right, but in the spirit of learning to speak this language, this philosophical language, both in general and as it relates to the work of Kant, we just have to be okay with partial understanding to start out. There's a kind of hermeneutic circle of understanding. One other thing I'll mention before we get started, I've talked about this before, but I'm running an intensive. It's a 6-week virtual intensive starting the week of May 4th. And the way I'm thinking about it now is as an exploration of what it means to approach philosophy as a practice of personal transformation. I'll circle back to some of this because I want to think about that question specifically with Kant in mind. I'll do that before we start reading. But if you'd like to go deeper, if you'd like to read some texts with others who are interested in cultivating an intellectual life, that's the title of the intensive, and going deeper in some of these questions, you can find out more. There's a link to a form, to an interest form, and I'll be sharing the syllabus for that soon. We have a question, which says, you asked me a question about the German language and the meaning of certain words during the last live stream. I'm still working on it. Thank you. Yeah, I will really look forward to what you come up with. And yeah, sometime it would be, I'd still like to do a session on this term, the things themselves, or things in themselves, that we get in Kant, but also later on in Husserl and in phenomenology, and which also goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle also uses this term, things themselves. So we have a fun challenge of translating from Greek to German to English, and I would not be surprised if there are some Latin equivalents as well. So a fun possible exploration there. So I want to start out by thinking on a high level about what Kant thinks he's up to and how it's different from other ways that we might think about philosophy. This question came up for me as I've been preparing the readings for the intensive from a couple of authors. So I'm going to just mention these. One is this book called Philosophy as a Way of Life. Sorry, trying to get this on the screen. By Pierre Hadot, who was a French philosopher. And Hadot looks primarily at Greek philosophy and argues that before it's he argues that the core interest is in what does it mean to live a good human life, and that all of the philosophical work is in service to that project. And so he argues that Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy, all ancient philosophy, is really a kind of spiritual exercise before anything else. It's about forming oneself, cultivating oneself, achieving inner freedom. And a key element of that practice or way of life is contemplation on one's own death, because the idea is that it's impossible to have a really accurate or we'll say accurate perspective on life itself if death isn't taken into account. And of course, it's so easy to deny and to forget death. I turned 40 a couple of weeks ago, and this question has been on my mind. Not that 40 is necessarily particularly old, but it feels like a kind of halfway mark. It feels like, it's easier to forget or deny or ignore the reality of death earlier in one's life. And over time, as you go, that question becomes more and more inevitable. And conversely, if we're not able to confront it, our existence, our way of living becomes less and less authentic. I think that's what Heidegger was trying to tell us. So this passage from Hadot, he says, I'm not going to put it on the screen, but I will read it, that Socrates exposed himself to death for the sake of virtue. He preferred to die rather than renounce the demands of his conscience, thus preferring the good above being, and thought and conscience above the life of his body. Preferring the good above being. This goes back to what we were reading in Plato 2 sessions ago, I think, about the good being the highest form, even higher than being. And Hadot says this, as sort of exposing oneself to death, is nothing other than the fundamental philosophical choice. Exposing oneself to death as the fundamental philosophical choice. If it is true that philosophy subjugates the body's will to live to the higher demands of thought, it can rightly be said that philosophy is the training and apprenticeship for death. As Socrates puts it in the Phaedo, it is a fact, Simmias, that those who go about philosophizing correctly are in training for death, and that to them of all men, death is least alarming. So philosophy as training for death. I don't recall Kant talking about this idea in any of his work. I haven't read every single thing that Kant has written, but I have read a good chunk of it. And I don't see this idea in Kant. And instead, what I see is Kant almost wanting to immortalize himself by being the founder of metaphysics, of like the true science of metaphysics, just the way that Newton was the founder of the true science of physics, or the way that Pythagoras was the true founder of certain things in mathematics. Kant views himself as establishing a sort of permanent fund of human knowledge in the form of his understanding of metaphysics, his taking stock of the full contents of human reason. In a way, Kant is trying to immortalize himself through his philosophy. And I mean, as far as one can succeed in that task, he did. But it's a very different approach to the philosophical task, because this idea of training for death is really about accepting the limits of oneself. And of course, Kant's philosophy is all about limits in a way, the limits of what reason can know, but not this particular limit. He doesn't, as far as I have seen, Kant doesn't really address this question of facing one's death, coming to terms with it, being in apprenticeship for death. I don't see this in Kant. he was kind of famously grumpy at the end of his life about how the next generation of philosophers really didn't understand his work. And you can see like we don't see this in Socrates. Socrates wasn't like, oh, you didn't understand me. You didn't understand the truth that I was trying to convey to you. If Socrates' followers disagreed with them, he would have asked them questions, certainly. He would have tried to send them into perplexity, but he wouldn't have said, you failed to like internalize my teachings and carry them forward correctly. So there's something very different there about Kant's approach to philosophy from what we might call the Socratic approach. We have another question. The ancient Greek philosophers were religious and intertwined their philosophy with their faith. How closely are religion and philosophy linked? That's an excellent question. Personally, I think very linked. I think I would view the distinction between religion and philosophy as a gradual one, not a sharply demarcated one. In other words, I don't think of there being like a strict separation between religion and philosophy, but others would disagree with me, and that's okay. Greek philosophy is not as religious as what you get in someone like Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, where you really have philosophy and theology working in a deeply integrated way. You could view someone like Socrates as, well, they called him impious. That's part of why he was killed, because he called the gods into question. So it's a good question, and Kant is also very engaged with this question of the relationship between religion and philosophy. As he said, denying knowledge to make room for faith. So I think we'll circle back to this question. One other thing I wanted to mention, and this is also from Socrates, this time though from Hannah Arendt's book, The Life of the Mind, which is another text that we will read part of for the intensive. But Arendt, she's speaking again of Socrates, says that for Socrates, the consequence of what, I'll leave it off for now, is the consequence is that thinking inevitably has a destructive, undermining effect on all established criteria, values, measurements of good and evil, in short, on those customs and rules of conduct we treat of in morals and ethics. So thinking is destructive of established, knowledge, quote unquote. These frozen thoughts, Socrates seems to say, come so handily that you can use them in your sleep. But if the wind of thinking, which I shall now stir in you, has shaken you from your sleep and made you fully awake and alive, then you will see that you have nothing in your grasp but perplexities. And the best we can do with them is share them with each other. Nothing in your grasp but perplexities. So Arendt is saying that for Socrates, the philosophical task involves bringing out perplexities and sharing them with each other, and that's it. There's no sort of landing point. And again, Kant is trying to do something very different. He does deal with perplexities. That is a kind of core element of his philosophical method, is articulating or highlighting contradictions that seem inevitable, and then trying to show the way past them. But unlike Socrates, Kant thinks that he provides us a kind of final fixed stopping point for human knowledge, for how we think about the capacities of human reason, what's possible there. Again, this is very different than the Socratic approach, and feels like it has something similar, something in common, or there's some sort of analogy with the absence of preparing for death in Kant's philosophy. Kant wants to do something that's permanent and final and immovable. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it's noticeably different from the approach to philosophy that we get in someone like Socrates. I think drawing this contrast, this was a new thought for me. It helped me to articulate some of what I think is really unique about what Kant is doing. And, seeing the uniqueness is part of what helps us engage in a more interesting way with each philosopher, seeing what they're doing and what they're not doing, which we can only get by way of contrast. Okay, so that's all by way of comparison. Welcome to everyone who is here. Anyone, of course, please feel free to drop comments or questions in the chat. I very much welcome it. It makes this a dialogue, and I think that makes it more philosophical. So please feel free to share your voice. Let's go to this footnote in the preface. This is the last thing that we have to read in the preface. I will get through it, but there's so much that we might say here. I'm going to start in. Kant is telling us about what he has changed in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And the only detailed discussion of the changes he's made are in this footnote. The rest is sort of high-level general stuff. So he says the only addition, strictly so called, though one affecting the method of proof only, so method of proof, not substance, is the new refutation of psychological idealism. See below, page 244. And a strict, also as I believe, the only possible, proof of the objective reality of outer intuition. Okay. Just there's so much to unpack. I'm going to jump forward. We're on page 34, and read us a couple of paragraphs here, which is what he was referring to. Refutation of idealism. Idealism, meaning thereby material idealism, is the theory which declares the existence of objects in space outside us either to be merely doubtful and indemonstrable, or to be false and impossible. So this is a little, the way he's using these terms is a little confusing. Need to get the iPad up. There we are. Okay, sorry about that. So he says material idealism. And he divides this into two types. The former is the problematic idealism of Descartes, which holds that there is only one empirical assertion that is indubitably certain, namely that I am. The other is the dogmatic idealism of Berkeley. He maintains that space, with all the things of which it is the inseparable condition, is something which is in itself impossible, and he therefore regards the things in space as merely imaginary entities. So let's write these down. Under the category of material idealism, Kant says we have two options. One is problematic, and this says that material objects are open to doubt. They're doubtful. So doubt is a problem for the existence of any objects outside the mind. Note that Kant says that Descartes, and of course this is Descartes, Descartes' assertion, I am, in the famous I think, therefore I am, is an empirical claim. Kant thinks that even one's consciousness of one's own existence is an empirical matter because it's a matter of experience. It's something we get from experience. The second option is dogmatic idealism, which actually says that it's not just that physical objects, material objects are open to doubt, but they're actually impossible. It's impossible for them to exist. Space is impossible, Berkeley. Let's read on to understand some of this a little more. Kant actually thinks Berkeley is on the right track. Dogmatic idealism is unavoidable if space be interpreted as a property that must belong to things in themselves. This is just where Kant's thinking just gets so wild. So he says Berkeley's argument is correct given a certain assumption, which seems obvious, which is that space, like spatiality, space and time, are something out there in the world, and that objects exist in space. And what Kant's going to say is that no, space is the a priori form of intuition. I didn't say that correctly, but it's something that we bring to experience. For in that case, space and everything to which it serves as condition is a non-entity. So Kant is saying space is actually not like a thing. The ground on which this idealism rests has already been undermined by us in the transcendental aesthetic. And when Kant uses the term aesthetic, he's talking about intuition. Problematic idealism, this is Descartes, which makes no such assertion, but merely pleads incapacity to prove, through immediate experience, any existence except our own, one's own, is, insofar as it allows of no decisive judgment until sufficient proof has been found, reasonable, and in accordance with a thorough and philosophical mode of thought. The required proof must therefore show that we have experience, and not merely imagination of outer things. So this is the problem Kant is trying to address. Do we actually experience things outside our minds? Kind of the classic modern way of framing this problem, so far as I understand it, would be like, how do we know that we're not just a brain in a vat somewhere, which is being stimulated with electrical currents to think that it's experiencing all kinds of things, when in fact it's just a brain. I think that way of putting it is kind of emphasizes the physical and then the neurological or the neuroscientific in a way that is foreign to the way that Kant is setting up the problem. So I think the modern version is not quite on point to what Kant is up to. But I think it may be more accessible to the kind of standard assumptions that modern people tend to bring, or contemporary people bring to these kinds of questions. He says, and this, it would seem, cannot be achieved, save by a proof that even our inner experience, which for Descartes is indubitable, is possible only on the assumption of outer experience. So that's pretty remarkable. We might diagram this. Descartes says we have inner experience, which cannot be doubted. And there's a line of argument from there to the idea that material objects are real. Or, that we're actually experiencing things outside of us. They're not just imaginary. Kant says, okay, that's fine. If we want to make that inference, he says, I'm not going to follow the exact path that Descartes went. I'm actually going to say that inner experience, which we cannot doubt, presupposes necessarily that there are things outside our minds. That's the basic move that Kant is wanting to make. So he's kind of turning Descartes inside out. Okay, so that gives us a little more context for this bit in the preface. I think it was page 37. No, 34. Here's where we are. So let's think a little bit more about some of these terms. We've talked about the objective reality of outer intuition, right here. Let's talk about this term, idealism. Go back to the iPad. I was reading about this a little bit in advance. It's interesting, the term idealism was coined by Christian Wolff, who was one of the most important predecessors to Kant in German philosophy. Wolff and Leibniz are kind of the two right before him, as well as Mendelssohn. I'm just going to read from Wikipedia, which says that idealism asserts that most fundamentally, reality is equivalent to mind, spirit, or consciousness. So reality equals mind or consciousness. That reality or truth is entirely a mental construct, or that ideas are the highest type of reality, or have the greatest claim to being considered real. Ideas are most real. And of course, we'd want to go right back to Plato for this. This is what Plato is saying, that the highest realities are the most abstract, and these are the things we can have the truest knowledge of. So let's try to think about how Kant is engaging this idea of idealism. And this is a diagram I've drawn, I think, on every live stream, which is that we have rationalism, a tradition of rationalism in philosophy, which includes folks like Wolff and Leibniz, Descartes, and we have a tradition of empiricism, Locke, Hume, Berkeley. We've talked about how rationalism, Kant thinks it leads to dogmatism, whereas empiricism leads to skepticism. And we can add now that rationalism tends to be idealist, whereas empiricism is realist. And we can add, in parentheses, naive realism. Naive realism is the idea that we can pretty much read the structure of reality straight off of experience without any kind of critical reflection. Reality is fairly transparent. There's a sort of commonsensical idea here that our capacity for knowing is reliable, that the things we experience in the world are straightforward, that reality is just there to be accessed and known and experienced, and that there's really no issue with this. This is not a problem, or there's nothing wrong about the way that works. This is the opposite of a kind of idealism, which says, no, the way that things appear to you is only the surface of reality. The deep structure of reality is mind, is spirit, is consciousness. As far as I understand Berkeley, the way he addressed this was to say that all of reality exists only because it is held in God's consciousness. God has consciousness of all of reality, and that's the only basis for it existing. And if it stopped existing in the mind of God, everything would just instantly vanish. It would no longer be there. Solipsism, as far as I understand that idea, if we want to go here, says it all exists in the perceiver's mind. There's nothing, here I am perceiving these things, but there is nothing outside of my consciousness, nothing outside of my perception. Of course, solipsism is kind of a form of skepticism. It seems fairly self-defeating, because to assert there is nothing outside my consciousness is already to make a claim about whether there is something outside my consciousness. And I would need to have access to something outside my consciousness to make that claim. So that seems like one of these kind of basic self-defeating positions, but it's helpful to have it in mind as a sort of placeholder or category. So Kant is engaging with both of these traditions, and he's here at the intersection. Of course, we'll also just mention that empiricism kind of carries forward in analytic philosophy. And rationalism carries forward in continental philosophy. And again, keeping in mind, these are heuristics. So we can use two terms to describe what Kant is doing, what's different, how he's engaging and transforming both of these traditions. The first would be critical realism. Remember the title of Kant's work, The Critique of Pure Reason. Critical realism says, yes, there are objects outside of us. There is an external reality, which is what we were just seeing Kant sort of set us up for, that he's going to make an argument for this. So he's a realist in that sense, but he's a critical realist. It's not just straightforward. It's not just obvious how our engagement with the world, with reality, or with experience works. There has to be this critical process to understand the nature of reason itself. Or we can call it transcendental idealism. This is Kant's position. This is how he distinguishes his position from the dogmatic idealism of Berkeley and the problematic idealism of Descartes. He says, my position is transcendental idealism. We're not going to be able to unpack that fully today, but this term transcendental is important for Kant. And a transcendental argument is one that takes something for granted, say experience, which we cannot doubt. It's impossible for us to doubt our experience, and the core of that thing that we can't doubt, Kant is going to agree with Descartes that what we really can't doubt is that here I am being conscious of my own experience. We can doubt various components of our experience, but that we are here, that I am conscious, that I exist in some form or fashion can't be doubted. So we have this core of experience that is fundamentally that we are incapable of doubting, even if we wanted to. And then, so we take this for granted. We have experience. Here we are. It can't be doubted. And then we ask, what are the conditions of possibility for that thing we're taking for granted? A transcendental argument goes from some given, asks about what would be necessary for that given to be the case, and makes inferences on that basis. So Kant's whole method in philosophy is transcendental in that sense. It takes certain things for granted, things that we cannot avoid believing, even if we wanted to, and reasons from there about what would have to be the case for these indubitable, these undoubtable facets of experience or of consciousness to be there. Again, this is complex terminology, but hopefully this starts to orient you a little bit to what Kant is up to. Okay, so let's read further in this footnote now. I need some coffee after that. So when Kant talks here about psychological idealism, I think he's using the term psychological in this sense, in the sense of like psyche, which is the Greek word for soul. And he's basically saying this idea that all experience is just in the mind. I think he's probably referring to dogmatic idealism, Berkeley's position. So he's saying he's changed the method here a little bit in his refutation of psychological or dogmatic idealism. So he says, however harmless idealism may be considered in respect of the essential aims of metaphysics, though in fact it is not thus harmless, it still remains a scandal to philosophy and to human reason in general that the existence of things outside us, from which we derive the whole material of knowledge, even for inner sense. Kant has a strict distinction between inner sense, how we perceive the contents of our own minds, and outer sense, which is how we perceive objects in reality or in the world, things in the world. Both of them are forms of sensation, however. They're not, we tend to think of like whatever's happening in our minds as like reasoning or, something different from experience out there in the world. Kant thinks these are both forms of sensation, inner sense, outer sense. Okay. It remains a scandal that the existence of things outside us must be accepted on faith. And we talked about what Kant means by faith a couple of sessions ago. I'm not going to expand on that right now. And that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof. So he says this is a scandal. It's scandalous that we don't have good proof for the existence of things outside us, other than a sort of faith, a practical trust. Since there is some obscurity in the expressions used in the proof, from the 3rd line to the 6th line, I beg to alter the passage as follows. But this permanent cannot be an intuition in me, for all grounds of determination of my existence, which are to be met with in me, are representations. That's an important term for Kant. Vorstellung, I believe. And as representations themselves require a permanent distinct from them, in relation to which their change, and so my existence in the time wherein they change, may be determined. Not going to worry about that too much right now, that paragraph or sentence. To this proof, it will probably be objected that I am immediately conscious only of that which is in me. That is, of my representation of outer things. So if we just try to write this out a little bit. So we have consciousness. Let's draw it like this, actually. We have things in the world. We have representations of those things. And then we have consciousness. Maybe we actually want to do it like this. Consciousness creates representations. Does it? Kind of. It's interesting to think about that. And representations are somehow gotten from things in the world. What Kant is saying here is just trying to move my things here. Just that when we have consciousness, it's not directly of things out there. We have a representation in our mind of the things, and that's what we are conscious of. And consequently, that it must still remain uncertain whether outside me there is anything corresponding to it or not. In other words, this bit, things in the world, is that there, or are representations in consciousness all that we really have? But through inner experience, inner sense, I am conscious of my existence in time, consequently also of its determinability in time. And this is more than to be conscious merely of my representation. So we also have a kind of representation of ourselves that is available to consciousness. And we find that the way we represent ourselves to ourselves includes time. It is identical with the empirical consciousness of my existence, which is determinable. I lost my place. Only through relation to something which, while bound up with my existence, is outside me. So he's saying time is outside of me, and I find that my representations of myself are bound up with time. I can't represent myself to myself without assuming time. He's doing something like a transcendental argument here. A condition for the possibility of my self-representation is time, and time is not part of my internal consciousness. So there must be time outside of me. This consciousness of my existence in time is bound up in the way of identity with the consciousness of a relation to something outside me. I cannot help in the way that I represent myself to myself. I cannot help doing that without bringing time into the representation. And I cannot help but recognize that time is something outside me. That's what he's saying. And it is therefore experience, not invention, sense, not imagination, which inseparably connects this outside something with my inner sense. I'm not just imagining it because it has to be outside me. Time does. For outer sense, here he's making this distinction between inner and outer sense, is already in itself a relation of intuition to something actual outside me. And the reality of outer sense, in its distinction from imagination, rests simply on that which is here found to take place. Namely, it's being inseparably bound up with inner experience as the condition of its possibility. I'll just remind you this term, intuition. On Shalom, going out on a limb, trying to produce these German terms from memory. But if you think about the way we use the word intuition as something like, you just have an intuition, you just know, as opposed to like, you can provide all the reasons. Like I just had an intuition that I should go to this place today, or I just looked at a painting and I sort of had an intuition about what it meant, even if I can't articulate exactly what that is. Intuition is something that takes in a whole just immediately. There's nothing in between. It's different from like reasoning or sort of discourse. Kant takes this idea of intuition. He also connects it to intuition and is a sort of aesthetic mode. Not in the sense that it has to do with beauty, which is the kind of standard way of thinking about aesthetics, but just in this mode of perception, immediate perception. Intuition is how sensation works, and vision is the most obvious example. We just take in the whole all at once through vision. That's what intuition is. This is a slight aside, but it's important to understand that, like with Plato, there is such a thing as intellectual intuition. There's something we can do with our intellect that is analogous to the way that vision works. We can take in the whole of some intellectual reality in this intuitive fashion. Kant, one way that Kant sharply distinguishes himself from someone like Plato is that he says, not possible. Intellectual intuition is strictly not possible, and it gets you into all kinds of problems if you try to go there. So this is what Kant means by intuition. So he says, I want to read this again. For outer sense is already in itself a relation of intuition to something actual outside me. And the reality of outer sense, in its distinction from imagination, rests simply on that which is here found to take place. Namely, it's being inseparably bound up with inner experience as the condition of its possibility. Ding, 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 that's a clue. He's making a transcendental argument when he speaks of condition of possibility. So if you remember, transcendental argument starts with experience or something that is given, something we cannot doubt. And it asks, what are the conditions of possibility for that thing? And what Kant is saying here is that outer sense, with its intuition of things in the world, is the condition of possibility, outer sense, for inner sense, which cannot be doubted. We cannot doubt our inner sense, our inner representations of ourselves, but we cannot conceive of those inner representations without also granting the validity of outer sense. He's, as I said before, he's kind of inverting Descartes. Descartes says, well, I have these internal things that I can't doubt, so I sort of reason from there to outer things. Kant's doing that in a way, but there's a different logical order. If we put it like this, for Descartes, we'll just say Descartes deduces outer from inner. I don't like that way of putting it. Descartes, it says, outer depends logically on inner. Kant says inner depends logically on outer. They both start with the fact that we cannot doubt inner experience. So they have the same starting point, but Kant reverses the logical order. He says, I don't deduce outer experience from inner experience. Rather, in encountering my inner experience, I find that outer experience is logically prior to it. It's a subtle distinction, but it's a key part of how Kant works philosophically. I saw your question that you deleted about whether intuition is a feeling. And the answer is, I would say no. A feeling, it depends what you mean by feeling. A feeling is could be an emotion, which would be different than intuition. If by feeling we mean something that's somewhat different than like reasoning or understanding, then that would be more or less accurate. Okay, let's keep going. If, with the intellectual consciousness of my existence, in the representation I am, checking on the stream here, which accompanies all my judgments and acts of understanding, I could at the same time connect a determination of my existence through intellectual intuition. That's what we were talking about a moment ago. The consciousness of a relation to something outside me would not be required. If we could have a sort of direct intellectual apprehension of the existence of external things, we wouldn't need to go through this argument. But though that intellectual consciousness does indeed come first, the inner intuition in which my existence can alone be determined is sensible. It's a form of sensation, internal sense. It is bound up with the condition of time. This determination, however, and therefore the inner experience itself, depends upon something permanent, which is not in me, and consequently can be only in something outside me, to which I must regard myself as standing in relation. So we can't have this inner sensation without taking for granted some permanent thing outside of me. And I think the reason he's saying this is because the inner sense, the representations of oneself to oneself, are bound up in time. they're changing, they're impermanent. And the recognition of this existence in time, or this the way that the representations are bound up with time and change, because time implies change, require that there be some non-changing thing in relation to which they stand. The reality of outer sense is thus necessarily bound up with inner sense, if experience in general is to be possible at all. Again, this is a transcendental argument. We have experience. What are the conditions of its possibility? We have inner sense. What must be the case for inner sense to happen? Well, Kant is saying outer sense. That is, I am just as certainly conscious that there are things outside me which are in relation to my sense, as I am conscious that I myself exist as determined in time. In order to determine to which given intuitions objects outside me actually correspond, and which therefore belong to outer sense, to which, and not to the faculty of imagination, they are to be ascribed, we must, in each single case, appeal to the rules according to which experience in general, even inner experience, is distinguished from imagination. So the whole question is, how do we know whether we're just imagining something versus whether we're having a perception or an intuition of something that is real out there? And he says there are general rules for making this distinction in our experience, which we can learn and learn to use. But the general question of, is there anything out there beyond consciousness? He says we have to assume that in order for our internal sensation to make sense. As he says here, the proposition that there is such a thing as outer experience being always presupposed. This further remark may be added. The representation of something permanent in existence is not the same as permanent representation. So something may exist permanently. That doesn't mean we are always representing it to ourselves. For though the representation of something permanent may be very transitory and variable, like all our other representations, not excepting those of matter, it yet refers to something permanent. This latter, therefore, must be an external thing distinct from all my representations. So the permanence of things that we represent to ourselves is distinct from the representations of those things in our minds. And its existence must be included in the determinations of my own existence, constituting with it but a single experience, such as would not take place, even inwardly, if it were not also at the same time, in part, outer. How this should be possible, we are as little capable of explaining further as we are of accounting for our being able to think the abiding in time, the coexistence of which with the changing generates the concept of alteration. So he's saying, I can't tell you how it's possible that that there are things outside me, or, outside my consciousness, or that my consciousness stands in relation to them in some fashion, but I have to assume that it's the case. That's as far as he goes. The details are in the work, but this is a preview of his argument, and I thought it worth going into this because it opens up some really important terms for Kant. We've talked about what a transcendental argument is. We've talked about inner sense versus outer sense. We've laid out some of these terms: idealism, realism, critical realism, transcendental idealism. There is a ton packed into this footnote. It's crazy. We also talked about intuition. Another term we could use for intuition is just perception. I'll write that down. We could just say perception. That's more or less equivalent. So if you need something to take away from today, I think this diagram, again, is handy. Just remember that we have Kant reckoning with this idealist tradition, which includes a problematic idealism of Descartes. We can doubt things outside of our consciousness, and a dogmatic idealism of Berkeley, which says there cannot be anything outside of consciousness. We have naive realism over here, and Kant wants to transform both of these ways of doing philosophy with his critical realism or transcendental idealism. We're almost at an hour. I'm going to wrap up here. There's so much more we can do, including looking at some commentators on this question. Maybe I'll do that next time. Again, if you're interested in an intensive, cultivating an intellectual life, you can check out the forum. I'd love to have you. And thanks to each of you who was here today. Thanks for your questions. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Also, you can find me on Substack if you just want to stay up to date on what I'm doing.